So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So my name is Michael Askins. I'm a practice manager at Pragmatic Works, and I have a specialty around infrastructure, IaaS, PaaS. I'm going to use a flippant term, all the plumbing that ties things together. That was my history. I came out of traditional infrastructure, and over the 20-some years in information technology, I was an early adopter of the cloud, early adopter of Azure. I'm a cloud architect, and specifically in the Azure space. So I'm always had a fondness for networking too. So back in the day, a little side here, back in the day, I actually used to not only work with the Microsoft stack, but the Cisco stack as well. So there was a lot of parallels to this presentation and my work history. So I'm excited to work with or present to you guys today. So we're going to go over some general overview of what Azure is, and along the way, or Azure networking. And as we go through this, I'm going to kind of socialize some of the things that I've seen over the years, give your teams and yourself some food for thought. So let's kick this off here. So essentially, we're going to cover what is Azure networking, what are the components that are considered networking inside there. We're going to break it down by solution type, and then we're going to talk about how do we get our hands around making sure we have a best practice methodology to move forward with the scaffold. So one of the things we want to look at is Azure Virtual Networking. What is it? So obviously, it enables resources to communicate with each other, the internet, on-premises networks, scope to a single region, though that region you can connect to other regions. This is where we're going to hit the road here. So essentially, Azure networking, these are the components you need to think of when you have yourself a network infrastructure in the cloud. You need to look at isolation and segmentation, how it communicates to the internet, should it communicate to the internet, communication between Azure resources, communication back home to our HQ, should we have a hybrid solution, or we need to bring some of that technology that is in the cloud, we need to do that compute out there. How do we get that output in communication to on-prem? How do we handle filtering and routing? And what do we do to try to connect to those virtual networks? So I'm going to kind of start at the top here with isolation and segmentation. So you can implement multiple VNets as you see them called out inside the Azure portal. I see some of you are just getting started in your journey, and one of the things you'll find that anytime you provision anything in Azure, it's going to ask you generally for a series of things. You know, one of those things is how's it connected to the internet? How's it connected to each other? How's it connected to storage? So one of the things you see is VNet. And when you hit that drop-down arrow inside of Azure, you can select an existing VNet or provision a new one. So those of you who are just getting started, you know, traditionally you go in there, you don't have anything started, so you click that button and you create this VNet, and it's going to spawn your VNet. There's considerations to that, though. We're going to talk through today on the choices you make by picking that VNet and how that VNet is handled. So specifically, if we look at that with isolation and segmentation, you can have multiple virtual networks inside a subscription in that region, right? You can specify that private IP address space. You can segment virtual networks into multiple subnets inside that VNet. And also, you know, you can leverage DNS, your own DNS or Azure DNS, which we will also cover later. So one of the takeaways from a tip or trick is to actually take the time before you deploy your resources. You know, it's often taken for granted a couple things. Networking is one and storage is the other. How we handle that. I've seen, I can't tell you how many times, I can't count, I don't have enough fingers and toes, when a security mindset falls in play and you create resources and you create a VNet for those resources, well, you're going to stand up a different workload, so you create another VNet. So instead of taking the approach that the VNet is your essential network out there and creating subnets and creating those controls as you traditionally would in your on-premises solution, one of the tendencies in the cloud is for people to say, I want a VNet for my prod, and we have this new application, I'm going to stand up this new VNet and put everything in there. What people find is that they don't talk together. Even if they're in the same subscription in Geo, there's things you have to do to make them talk together. And we will cover those here shortly. So isolation and segmentation is key. So one of the things we always recommend is that you actually draw out that topology, get on the whiteboard, get on Visio, draw out what your application looks like, instead of just drawing that computer, that server, that app symbol, and saying this is all connected together. Kind of jot down that IP space underneath it so you can actually think through, what does it need to talk to? Does it need to connect to storage? Does it need to connect to other applications? Does it need to connect to back home? Second line, communicating with the internet. So this is one of the other things that winds up becoming a challenge for organizations who don't map out what it looks like. So by default, all resources in a virtual network can communicate outbound to the internet. That is by default, and that's often overlooked. When you stand up an application and there's a VM, you put a storage account out there. Storage account won't be directly exposed, but it's the underlying or the overlying resource that's going to connect to it is exposed to the internet. So you want to think through each VNet. What is it coming in? What needs to come in? I have customers that are in the secure world: banking, finance, oil and gas, government, and all those customers, there's a lot of VNets they have that have zero communication with outside world. Public IPs are cut off. We remove that access. We remove RDP from the servers, so they're just not sitting there waiting for an attack surface to come in. So on that drawing that I'm recommending you make, either in Visio, whiteboard, a loose leaf paper, what have you, however you want to do it, you need to map it out, right? And while you're mapping it out, one of the things, aside from just the IP schemes, is what does it need to connect to? Does it need to be publicly available? Is this an application server that needs to be available to my geo-dispersed workforce? Or is this PaaS service something that is a web service that definitely needs to be available? We want to think through that and write that out and chart that off. So other things you can do to kind of manage and mitigate that is to use load balancers, to use web application firewalls. These are all the options that you can see from the marketplace when you're in the Azure portal that often become cumbersome to our minds by, do we need this and what's the cost? And I'm just going to use the default and revert back to traditional ways. We actually do want to think of, load balancing and providing high availability, multi-region, multi-geo access to applications and data is critical. So in thinking through how we're going to connect to it, we need to look at that isolation segmentation. Does it need to talk to the internet? And then the next piece is how does it communicate with other resources? So you can connect multiple, as I mentioned, we will talk to this, you can connect multiple VNets together. You can connect multiple VNets in multiple regions together. There's something that you may have seen in the portal if you've poked around in the networking pieces. It's called peering. So peering is a way in which your subnets inside of a VNet will allow you to talk to subnets in another VNet. There's different types of peering. There's exit peering, where it'll aggregate everything and have it exit through a public IP. There's peering where I'm going to scope my VNet and my subnets only to my headquarters in a hybrid situation and to another geo because I need to have high availability. So we want to think how we're going to handle that. You can deploy these VMs in other types of resources like app service, Kubernetes, AKS, virtual machine scale sets. There's a whole list that Microsoft provides you for everything that you can do to communicate these through a virtual network. So one of the other options are, and these are more for, as I mentioned, some security-minded organizations, not that we're all not security-minded, but some have a little more stringent governance and controls in place. So one of the things we like to leverage are endpoints. There's service endpoints, essentially extend your virtual network private space and the identity that's required to authenticate on that space. It allows you to take that and take that Azure service resource, such as storage accounts, SQL databases, and you can do that over a direct connection. So this is another mechanism in which you can get to your data and your VNets. You can harden all your machines and you can harden everything, and you only want to allow what can come through. Again, you're going to hear me probably a couple more times say this. I can't stress enough to chart out and map what that networking needs to look like and who or what needs to talk to the stuff inside of that VNet. And by doing that, it'll allow you to have that great mindset of, I'm just going to lock the world out except for this particular endpoint that's going to connect to my SQL services, and what's allowed across it is only authenticated and allowed through what I allow it to come through. So one of the things I had mentioned was, it's on our list here, is to communicate with our on-premises resources. So there's multiple ways to do that. One of the ways we can do that is to handle point-to-site virtual private networking and site-to-site VPN and ExpressRoute. They're the three main ways we can handle communicating with our Azure services. A lot of people do not or a lot of organizations miss the point-to-site piece. There is a specific use case that, in my opinion, that it does apply. It's not one of those things where it's widely deployed. Most organizations leverage a site-to-site VPN. You're now traversing the public internet as you would if you were connecting to a colo or if you're connecting to a branch office. You have your networking gear, Cisco, Palo Alto, what have you, and you have one at the other end, and you create that peering and you create that secure channel, and you can write across it. Very similarly, you have that site-to-site VPN capabilities. A lot of organizations do this, especially if they are in a hybrid model. It's the lower cost in of the three. ExpressRoute being a little more, from a cost and fiscal perspective, a little more higher on the scale there. ExpressRoutes are often clouded and shrouded in mystery. Everybody thinks it's this veil of the ExpressRoute magic that makes things happen. So the way I like to describe ExpressRoute is ExpressRoute is essentially an MPLS extension. So if you're a networking person, MPLS is that type of connection that a lot of organizations use now, and it's essentially an extension of your network. And so there's controls and things in place. It's a guaranteed pipeline. It's secure. It's encrypted, and only your traffic's going across that bandwidth. You can have up to a 10 gig ExpressRoute without blinking an eye. So you have this high quality, fast throughput of information, and you can have that ExpressRoute endpoint in multiple locations if you're large. We really, from a tips and tricks perspective, if you do need a secure connection, not that site-to-site VPN is not secure, but with quality of service and the ability to have that guaranteed pinned up bandwidth, we really recommend you talk to Pragmatic Works or Microsoft to help with that decision making. There are various types and ways in which that ExpressRoute can be stood up and pinned up and provisioned. The one I mentioned earlier, the point-to-site virtual private networking, is one that's often overlooked. It's kind of a one-to-one with an endpoint. So if you think of, if your organization is using Cisco and you got that AnyConnect, or if you think of Palo Alto's Global Connect, you think of all these services that have all this hardware standing there, and you have a client on your machine that connects to the virtual network. You're on your corporate network. Think of the point-to-site like that. And that's the exact use case in which I would recommend it. So it's great for developers. It's great for a mobile management work team that needs to really get at those resources. If you are doing point-to-site for your whole organization as a VPN workaround, there are other ways to accomplish that. Though I want to just call out is generally I recommend point-to-site for developers or administrators that need to have that connection. One of the other use cases that point-to-site works really well is if you have some Power BI resources out there that are not connected to the network, but the Power BI resources are sitting in Azure. One of the good ways to have that accomplished is to have a point-to-site. There is a configuration. There's two levels of point-to-site. Generally, from the use cases that I recommended, that first level is generally good enough. If you're looking to actually replace a Global Connect or a AnyConnect, Global Protect or AnyConnect, those two would be next tier level. Now you're looking at managing your endpoints, and everything is going through Azure from your endpoint perspective, including your Office 365 work. As mentioned again, ExpressRoute. If you do have an ExpressRoute or have challenges or want to provision something like that, we do recommend that you reach out. And again, to call out the difference between the two, site to site does go across the internet, and the ExpressRoute is a direct connection into the Microsoft networks. So next on our list is filtering network traffic. So this is a often done practice. Some of this can be accomplished in multiple layers, and we're going to go through the core Azure first, and then I'm going to talk to some of the other methodologies which we can do it. So you can filter network traffic between subnets using these following options. So you have security groups, network security groups, and application security groups. There's multiple inbound and outbound security rules that you can enable to filter your traffic from the resources from source and destination. Port protocol, it's very deep at the security group level. Again, I mentioned about how you stand up your resources and mapping that out. I also recommend that you map out your security in Azure. And not just network security, security in general. There are security levels and many order of operations and what you need to deploy things, which you'll have a better handle and control on. So that's another one of the tips that I often tell organizations that have stuff out there that was just largely like, we want to get in that space, and so they just did. Or organizations that are like, we know we need to be in that space, so we're just starting. So please take that as one of the #1 takeaways, is to map out what things look like. That way you can put your order of operations together, and it'll make your deployments that much more smooth. And something I'll mention later is appliances. Specifically, if you don't have that mapped out, one of the things you'll find is when you start deploying, say, an appliance, a network appliance or a security appliance from the marketplace, you'll find that it'll be difficult for you to accomplish getting to the end and passing validation if certain things aren't done in certain orders of operations. Resource groups being created, making sure that we have the VNets and the subnets inside that VNet defined, what's going to go in each part of the range of that subnet. Having that all charted out in advance will make your deployments, and not just from a networking perspective, from an IaaS or PaaS perspective, knowing that order of operations and having those pieces complete so it's a selection inside your blades when you're deploying a resource, that is key to success. So as I mentioned, there's two main areas for filtering network traffic: security groups, and a quick recap. Security groups, application, inbound, outbound security rules, filtering traffic, and then we have network virtual appliances. A network virtual appliance essentially is a VM that does the same network functions that you would if you had a piece of hardware. So there are a couple of the things that do that is WAN optimization, network filtering. There's a full list of appliances in the marketplace that are available. And this is the point in which I mentioned to you that you may actually have an entitlement, but using your existing gear, leveraging your existing spend, you may have an entitlement for a reduced cost appliance in Azure. For example, Cisco Networks has some NV1000 entry-level firewalls that you can layer filtering and you can layer firewall rules on top of. They have a BYOL model, bring your own license model. So depending on how your organization is structured with your traditional networking spend, one of the things you might find is you can get provisional licensing as you transfer from maybe on-premises to cloud, or say you don't need that giant firewall that costs a 6-figure number. You need to scale that back because more and more that traffic is being offloaded, that traditional gear is not as needed to be as like resource intensive and beefy and be able to handle the world. So one of the things that you can do is speak with your hardware rep and say, okay, I'm moving to Azure. What can you do for me from a licensing perspective? Because I'm not going to deploy this later. And you can get provisional licenses. FortiGate is another firewall model that does very similar things. So and here's a tip for you when you deploy virtual appliances, that's what we're calling out here on this presentation. One of the things you want to be concerned on is when you actually deploy that model, you're going to be given a choice in your blades to choose the type of VM that's going to run this appliance. Traditionally, they are Linux appliances, and the thought and the mindset is I want to keep costs low, so I'm going to pick a low model, or the model that's suggested to you does have just enough to make it do what it needs to do. Again, staying with the theme of charting it out, when we start looking at what we want to do from a protection and isolation perspective, if we're going to have an appliance in place, occasionally your model may have multiple NICs on it, just as a traditional network firewall would or a network appliance would. So, you have your data in out, you have your management port, you have all these different ports on the back of a firewall. You have those options for an appliance, though the dependency isn't as great. We are constrained in the physical world by how fast we can physically push bits, right? On the network side with software-defined networking, that gets increased. A lot of it's code. So that's why it's software-defined. So one of the things I found is a lot of organizations say, I want to put this Fortinet firewall in, and my configuration has multiple subnets, and I want to have them isolated on those interfaces. You can easily accomplish that. But if you're picking that lower VM, the one thing that's overlooked is there's only so many NICs on that VM you're allowed to have. So having an understanding of the sizing of that virtual machine to what the use case and how you intend to use it. Not just can it handle my resources, but can it also physically match out or virtually physically match out to how I want to lay out my logical diagram. So keep that in mind when you're deploying virtual appliances. The other thing you'll find is that if you go to the marketplace, the one thing you'll find is that a lot of these organizations like Palo Alto and Cisco, they give you a trial period for you to get in there and test your configuration and see what that looks like. I strongly urge every organization should have a test tenant so they can deploy items. Yes, please deploy these test tenants to make sure your configuration can work. And again, on the appliance side, Cisco and Palo Alto both have the ability for you to write your configuration offline and then just upload it into Azure. That in itself is, software defined from physical to hardware, but it'll also break the way you work. So take your configuration, upload it into that 1000V or that Palo Alto, test it. So routing network traffic. Azure routes traffic between subnets inside that VNet and back to on-premises networks and to the internet by default. I'm going to keep bringing that up. It needs to be known that by default you can get at your resources. When you deploy a VM, what's the thing that you see on the upper top of your blade is connect. You click that button, you're on the internet, and you're going to get an RDP file and you're going to connect to it. So you might want that. Some organizations don't. They don't want to have every one of their VMs exposed in that manner. So please keep that in mind. So when you're routing traffic, there's a couple ways to handle it. Inside of Azure, same as traditional networking, you can create custom route tables. Draw it out. Again, if you're doing your mapping of what you're deploying, how you're securing it, what appliances need to talk to where and what subnet, you'll have a great understanding. By default, if you deploy it in that mechanism, in that framework in which I had mentioned to you, things will communicate as should. Though there are times where you need custom route tables. It just happens, right? Nested VMs, nested services require route tables, and you can have route tables inside of Azure straight up native core. BGP, if you connect your virtual network to your on-premises network, or you're using an Azure VPN Gateway, ExpressRoute, you can propagate your routes through BGP. And our last on this slide is connecting those virtual networks. You can wire those virtual networks up together. And I had mentioned this already through peering. It's very critical that when you draw out your maps and you draw out your locations and you draw out your regions, you consider peering, because a decision early affects your organization down the line. So one of my other biggest takeaways, and we'll address this at the end of the session, and most of these infrastructure related, we have a methodology on how we like to achieve what we need to achieve, so we can not only deliver you that great service from an Azure perspective, but we also want to make sure we connect the dots from a cost perspective. We want to make sure that it's affordable. We want to make sure that it's right size to what you need to do. So in looking at those that peering, it should be known that the decision you make to put stuff in one VNet and stuff in another VNet, potentially in another region, you're going to incur costs for that peering. That peering will cost your organization on your consumption plan. So keeping in mind that, yes, there is a need to have multiple VNets. Yes, to separate dev, prod, test maybe. That is definitely a need. What should be considered also is that, do I need to wire them together? Because there are real costs associated. So I know we are about halfway through, and I'm about a third of the way through the slides. So I will try to kick it up a little bit here for you. So Azure networking overview, again, it's a global network. You can build out to reach your customers. You can have endpoints, exit points everywhere throughout the regions that are specified in Microsoft, and it's becoming impressively large from a global perspective. You can secure your environment. The one thing, if anyone has ever heard me speak before, Microsoft is a true enterprise-ready cloud that has all the certifications that you would need. Allows you to monitor your resources. So there's built-in monitoring for Azure Monitor. Will allow you to know what's going on. It's reliable. It's private. You can harden it as hard as you need to have it hardened, or you can have it as open as you need to have it. So I did cover in depth some of these items earlier, so we're just going to kind of go over the ones that stick out that we did not cover. So networking in Azure, there's areas, and everybody thinks networking, and you might, if IT, you might get a shrug unless you're in networking. You're like, networking. No, networking is key. It's delivery. As we see on the screen, we have a content delivery network option in Azure. Traffic Manager is key. Traffic Manager is one of the most deployed pieces to allow the shuttling of data to where it needs to go to meet performance and availability perspectives. DDoS protection is huge. As you start providing resources publicly or to your teams, you're going to want to, especially if you're visible in public, you're going to want to have some sort of protection in place. And Azure DDoS protection does just that. The Azure Firewall, it's a native firewall capabilities that's built into Azure. Not stating that Cisco and Palo Alto and some of the other partners that are in the marketplace, not one is better than the other. It's use case specific, though, especially if you're just getting started out and you need some layer, some level of protection. The Azure Firewall is something that I would really recommend somebody check out. A lot of the times organizations take a NIC and a VNet and they scope out services to a specific machine across that profile and say, I just want port 80 traffic or 443 or what have you. That's just one layer. And if you have a security mindset, and if you've ever heard your security teams, if you're not involved with them, there's something called depth in security that is something that's required, right? And having these layers are important. And I'm going to go back to the theme of today's talk, is that understanding your map out and your documentation of what you are deploying and having those security boundaries, it's critical to know which pieces along the way. I've had organizations deploy marketplace, third party or marketplace partner firewalls, but they also do firewall rules on their VNets inside their networking. And so you got that multiple layer, that's great, but when something topples or you need to maybe expand or add services, you have multiple places to look at now. So you have to have in your documentation control what that flow of data looks like and what security gates you're going through. That's critical there. We mentioned earlier load balancing. Obviously, that's a native type of a situation there, and as well as the Azure Front Door service. So you got scalable security enhanced, deliverable for microservices, right? That's what a lot of organizations are pivoting to, microservices. If you're not in the development world, or if you're in like traditional IT, or if you're in the data space, one of the things from a developer perspective that organizations are doing is diminishing the need for high-powered machines sitting there running and crunching numbers, and then having all the security and network controls ping-ponging the requests and the data back and forth. So we're being more nimble. We're doing container services, we're doing microservices that allows fast compute, that allows delivery of data in a much more efficient way, and it allows for uptime, it allows for CI/CD, continuous improvement, continuous development, without as much disruption. So what does that mean from a networking perspective? That means we're going to diminish our need for having to maintain and manage this giant wide footprint of NICs and security appliances, and we're going to streamline that into service-based applications. And that also means that we have to pivot our minds on how we're handling the delivery, but also the security, and how do we harden that and maintain that and make that scalable. So keep in mind that Azure does have a answer for that, and that's the front door service. So again, I talked through most of these already, so I'm just going to skip over this slide. So the presentation you'll get from a video perspective. This particular screen, if you screenshot it, if you want to take it from the presentation that we'll send you afterwards, even if you're not a steely-eyed network guy and you get up in the morning to do IPv6 calculations, this is the kind of thing that you want to have kind of out of the corner of your eye when you're deploying stuff, when you're thinking of stuff. It's constantly there saying, okay, do I need to have DNS in Azure, my DNS, or is it Azure's DNS? Which virtual network am I working from? Do I need a load balancer or a traffic manager? How am I connected? What am I doing? It's nice to have that little out of the corner of the eye reminder that we need to make sure we stay focused on this, and we also follow the data from beginning to end. So the content delivery network, as I mentioned, I'll touch on a couple of these items here. So the CDN that Microsoft has with Azure, obviously reduce load time, save bandwidth, speed responsive. Everybody's familiar. In 2019, the need for CDN, the question is do you need a CDN? It's very deep from an Azure perspective. It allows connectivity to lots of services and resources that you can replicate into regions and zones that you want to have your data sitting at. A great use case is I have a customer who's a publisher, and they have pivoted from the print edition to the digital edition, and they were having challenges, and they were shutting services off East Coast time, but the rest of the world still needed their stuff, or the services were diminished after they kept it on for 24 hours. So how do you get that content around so that somebody maybe in PAC Asia or the EU or the West Coast, how do we get that data to them quick? Or how do I get my data internally to my teams internally quickly? And the CDN is one of those ways. We had mentioned ExpressRoute already. So this is a great overview for you. You can go up to 100 gig, blazingly fast, really good pinned up connection. Azure DNS. So you can use and leverage Azure DNS alongside your applications. It's ultra high availability, though recently there was an issue. Fast DNS queries are super fast. You get your updates throughout the Azure network. Normally faster than what your traditional DNS would do, and it supports all the standard DNS entry record types. So you're diminishing the need to have a box. You're putting it as a service. So then I'm going to put that asterisk out there and say that here's something to keep in mind. That yes, I love Azure DNS, though there are times you want to have some of your traditional DNS. So you need to manage stub zones a little bit differently, or you have things that are, from a network perspective, delayed. I see organizations who have a presence over in EMEA that don't update their DNS, but for a 12-hour difference. And one of those reasons are, if you have a really dispersed DNS network, you can limit what goes where by delaying that delivery of that DNS. So instead of propagating something that is wrong, it gives you time to not globally topple your DNS. Though there are some options in the Azure DNS, and it's getting more and more, spread more and more feature sets, that is something to consider. And we also sometimes see organizations who take a security posture is we don't want our DNS replicating around on servers we don't know, so they wind up coupling servers or VMs that have the DNS service sitting on them in Azure. So there are multiple opportunities. One size does not fit all, and you need to find out what's best for you. Generally, Azure DNS works just well for the majority of use cases. So we discussed virtual networking. You get that granular control of your traffic. You get that hybrid going. Hybrid is huge in this day and age of, I want some stuff here and I need some stuff there. It's critical to, have that map and that drawing and make sure that we have an understanding on what we're doing. Traffic manager we discussed. High level, it's high available. Better app responsiveness. If the machines that are servicing my app here in the East Coast are coming out of the region East or East 2 or my particular part of the country, it doesn't have to come all the way across from the West Coast. But I have a coworker in Washington State. I want them to have the same experience as me. Let's talk about Traffic Manager as that solution. Load balancing is just that. It helps that high availability, allows some automation there. VPN Gateway. So again, connecting your local infrastructure to the cloud. Site-to-site IPsec, 99.9 SLA for VPN gateways. It's highly available, easy to manage. You can secure that from anywhere. Just know that VPN gateways are site-to-site, and you are traversing the public internet. Application gateways, the uptime and SLA for that is really well compared to other cloud providers. You can have, customized 7 load balancing solutions. You can have centralized SSL offloading and SSL policy controls at your fingertips. You get to control that. It's not a service that like some other cloud providers that say, here's an application gateway and here's the framework in which you need to function. The Azure Application Gateway allows you to control how you develop your application, how you service that application. With, again, SSL, cookie-based session affinity, which is huge. If anybody's familiar with SSL offloading, that's giant. And you can manage it through Azure APIs. The DDoS protection, as we mentioned, DDoS protection, it's always on monitoring. It's looking for that network attack to happen, and it's going to mitigate it. It's going to give you a little peace of mind that you're maybe a highly visible organization, or you're in an industry that is targeted by some bad actors. It allows you to handle this and have a good peace of mind. It does integrate with Azure Monitor for analytics and insights, which is wonderful. I can't speak highly enough of Azure Monitor and all that it does from a visibility perspective, and the ability to leverage Azure Monitor to be reactive especially for networking and storage and VMs. Those are the core, and PaaS services too. That's the core of what we're trying to deliver and or develop on. So why should we not know its state and the telemetry around it? And the piping of the DDoS protection into that is great. It allows us to make decisions, allows us to react and be on top of that. Network Watcher allows you to monitor, diagnose, and gain insights to your network, its performance and its health. You can capture that packet data. You can do some analysis on it. You can, monitor your virtual machine security using the logs and security group views. If anybody's familiar with, the old flow, or there's a new flow too, but the traditional flow that, NetFlow and PSAR and all these other tools that are out there, it's built into Azure and allows you to click and turn on that and get those insights. You can look at your VPN connectivity, especially if you're site to site. As I mentioned, you're going across the public internet. Let's look at what's happening. And so, like, again, one of the takeaways is if you have networking components inside of Azure, you need to look at Azure Monitor. The cost for the small storage account that would hold that Azure Monitor data pales in comparison to the insights that you get from not just networking, but from your healthier PaaS services, health of your VMs, health of your whole Azure environment. Azure Firewall, again, recapping, it's a stateful firewall as a service. It's fully integrated with Azure Monitor as well. It's great for hybrid, so you can help get that VPN and that ExpressRoute gateways. You can have full flow from beginning to end. Some cloud providers' firewalls are essentially firewalls that stand in front of the devices and the public internet. This Azure Firewall is between network communications. It doesn't mind if you're on-prem, it doesn't mind if you're in the cloud. You deploy it in how you choose to deploy it. So virtual WAN, that's the simplified, unified, global connectivity and security. It says it all, right? So things to call out for that, it does great for large-scale branch connectivity. Allows for policy management across your global org or across your nation org. And it also is optimized routing using Microsoft's global networking. So if anyone has ever seen the Microsoft presentations where they show the map of the world and they have all their data centers, and then, akin to 1980s, you see these big line arcs coming out of it and connecting to each other, and before you know it, you can barely see the map. Yes, that's how deep in the breadth of what Microsoft's global network is definitely impressive. Again, to the front door service, central control plane for your traffic, global HTTP, load balancing, allows failover. I'm going to call out again that it's great for that microservice. It's great for that small PaaS payloads. It's also great for large payloads, but we see more and more of this this as an entry point for fast delivery, getting your applications out there and deployed. So again, I mentioned Azure Monitor. So there's full stack visibility. We get great insights. It's proactive and it's super open. Azure Monitor is from beginning to end, cradle to grave, whichever phrase you want to use. It's holistic to your environment, but specifically to this topic, it's specifically going to help pipe in all those pieces and give you visibility. So we want to make sure that we're on top of that and we get that insight. We don't want to just deploy a service and not know if it's working and then have to figure out where I need to go to find out why something is not maybe fine-tuned the way we thought, or maybe we made a choice for something and it's having undesired output. Where do I go to get that information? Yes, if you have a Cisco or a Palo Alto, you can get at those logs, or you can have everything piped into one place and have event correlation. That's key. Azure Advisor, that's another thing that I really recommend that organizations do. Azure Advisor is one of those options where you have you log into your portal and you see that screen. Azure has recommendations. If you're in the room, I'd say show of hands on how many people just totally skip by that, and the majority of the hands will go up. We really recommend you take a look at that. You know, as an organization or as a professional that often goes into other organizations to make recommendations, you know, one of the things I first pull is the Azure Advisor recommendations, and I start looking at those. And then, you know, yeah, that's going to get you part of the way there, but there's a whole nother section to go before you actually fine tune and tool what you need to fine tune and tool. But you have a starting point that's built into your environment, built into your tenant. Leverage it. It's generally correct. There's very, very few times have I seen an Azure environment recommendation come across that's, you know, not accurate or totally out of left field. So next steps, as I mentioned, you know, one of the things we do is we have the Azure Scaffold, which is a best practice framework. It's a Microsoft framework, actually more for EA. We have adopted it for all Azure customers. So the core network is one of the things that we cover in there. And some of the topics we talked about today, and how do you handle, what's the best way to deploy solutions, and what order do I deploy solutions? What order, you know, do I pull something from the marketplace or do I just build it myself? What are my governance requirements? What are my security requirements? Do I have the right policy in place? Am I looking at the right monitoring and alerting pieces? What telemetry and what metrics am I looking at to determine what's sustainable for my organization? So if you do have any questions or have any needs, please reach out to a, you know, Pragmatic Work, send an email, follow up with this session today, and we'll be more than happy to talk through all these different steps. Because each one of these steps that are on here has about 25, if not more, pieces to those steps that helps build today. Everyone have a great day.
All right, thank you, Michael. We appreciate it. Sorry, I think I might have lost you guys here a little bit, but as you guys know, the recording will be in your emails tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And if you guys have any more questions or comments, please feel free to leave a question. Shoot us an email or just shoot us a question on here. Thank you guys so much for joining. Michael, are you still there?
I am.
Okay, I didn't know if you wanted to take a few questions here. We have about 7-8 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Do you want me to read them off for you, or do you want to?
Yes, if you can, because I'm not seeing the questions come across in my pane.
Yeah, no problem. That's completely fine. The first question is from Simon. I wonder if Azure could connect to VMs in, excuse me if I pronounce this wrong, ESXi host?
Yes, it can. ESXi is via VMware, yes. So you can route out what that would look like. So if you have a hybrid situation where you have VMs sitting on an ESX host and then you have resources sitting in Azure, you can connect those up, you can wire that up. There's multiple ways to do that. You can do that at the host level, you can do it at the guest level. That's something that we'd want to talk about, what your use case is and how do we, what's the best way to accomplish that. Just gonna throw a side note there, Azure and ESX are friends. It seems kind of odd, but they are friends. Like for example, Azure Site Recovery does work at the host and guest level for ESX. So you can have Azure Site Recovery back up your whole ESX environment to Azure and then have that as a failover situation should something blow up or you have a physical outage or you need to have high availability. You can have Azure as a target for that with ESX.
All right, perfect. The next question is the same. Oh, okay, hold on. What tool is needed to connect? Okay, I think you already answered that. Can we use a virtual firewall for Azure Cloud?
Yes, you can. The virtual firewalls, there are some in the marketplace that they scale very similar to what you would see as an on-premises solution. So for instance, I'm just going to call out the 3 of the main ones that are often used: Cisco, Palo Alto, and Fortinet. They all have virtual appliances in Azure. If you have a virtual appliance on-prem and you want to connect into Azure, it's about the connectivity and the IP connectivity, not the hardware at that point.
All right. Since virtual firewall is a piece of software tool loaded in VMware as an appliance, wonder if this could be used as a firewall in Azure. I think we already answered that one. See if there's any more connections. That looks like that's about it.
Okay, sounds good. If there are any other questions or you want to talk through specific configurations, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to do it.
All right, perfect. And like I said, guys, this will be in your email tomorrow, so stay tuned for the recording. And like Michael said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to him or myself. And thank you guys so much for joining. Michael, again, thank you so much for hosting. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Crystal.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.